On a windy Tuesday in March, 50-year-old Naomi Whitcomb handed over a certified check for $2,600 and signed her name to 80 acres of cracked, blinding white salt flat in Millard County, Utah. Ground so barren the county assessor had valued it at less than the cost of the fence posts needed to mark its boundary. The Kessler family, who'd held the parcel for 3 generations without ever finding a use for it beyond the occasional grazing lease nobody wanted, shook her hand and left without asking why a laid-off lab technician would want ground that produced, by every visible measure, absolutely nothing. Why would they ask? They'd just sold 80 acres of dry, cracked salt pan that hadn't supported so much as a blade of grass in living memory. Sold it to a 50-year-old woman with a hatchback full of unemployment paperwork and a reputation, among her former university colleagues, for being unusually thorough about things most people considered beneath careful attention. Nobody in Millard County thought Naomi had made a sound decision. The diner had theories. Her own brother called from Salt Lake City to ask, gently, whether she was doing all right. And somewhere beneath that blinding white crust, in the ancient brine trapped in the playa's subsurface sediment layers, sat a lithium concentration so unusually rich that, within 18 months, 3 separate mining and battery materials companies would be locked in a genuine competitive dispute over access rights to Naomi's worthless salt flat. Nobody knew, not the Kessler family, not the county, not the mining industry that had surveyed the broader region for decades without focusing closely on this particular parcel. Nobody except, eventually, Naomi. If stories of ordinary people who trust their own careful attention when everyone else has moved on inspire you, subscribe and join us. We bring you real stories with real lessons behind them. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if the story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find people who care about stories like Naomi's. Now let's uncover exactly how a cracked Utah salt flat changed one woman's life. Naomi Whitcomb was not a geologist by formal credential, though after 22 years working as a laboratory technician in a university earth sciences department, she understood mineral analysis and brine chemistry with a depth that outstripped most people's assumptions about what a technician's role actually involved. She'd run sample preparation, calibrated instruments, and processed geochemical data for 3 decades of graduate students and faculty researchers, absorbing, through sheer repetition and genuine curiosity, a working fluency in exactly the kind of subsurface brine analysis that mattered most for what she'd eventually find beneath her own property. She was 50 when a round of university budget cuts eliminated her position, along with 2 colleagues, the previous autumn, ending a career she'd built her entire adult life around without much warning or ceremony. She had the steady, unhurried patience of someone who'd spent decades doing careful, repetitive laboratory work correctly rather than quickly, and the particular disappointment of watching a stable professional identity disappear through a decision made several administrative layers above her, for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of her work. Her brother, Curtis, who worked in commercial real estate in Salt Lake City, had watched Naomi's job loss with the kind of concerned bewilderment siblings often bring to a situation they don't fully understand. When she mentioned that following spring that she was thinking about buying a piece of land out in Millard County, he assumed reasonably that she meant something modest and residential. A salt flat, he said, more statement than question, once she explained the actual parcel. Naomi, that ground doesn't grow anything. It doesn't do anything. It's just salt. Naomi told him that was, more or less, exactly what interested her about it. What had caught Naomi's attention wasn't the salt flat itself so much as a technical detail she'd noticed almost by accident the previous winter, reviewing old regional brine survey data during one of her final projects before the layoff. Utah's western desert basins, including several salt playas considerably better known than the obscure Millard County parcel the Kessler family was trying to unload, had drawn increasing industry attention in recent years for subsurface brine deposits carrying commercially significant lithium concentrations, driven by the mineral's soaring demand for electric vehicle battery production. Most of that industry attention had concentrated on a handful of well-documented basins. Naomi's old survey data, dense with the kind of technical brine chemistry notation most casual readers skipped past entirely, suggested the Kessler parcel's underlying playa sediment shared several key geochemical markers with those better-known deposits, despite having never been seriously sampled or surveyed itself. She mentioned the idea to a former colleague, Dr. Priya Anand, a hydrogeologist she'd worked alongside for over a decade before the layoff, mostly to sanity check her own reasoning before committing real money to it. Dr. Anand reviewed the old survey notation Naomi pointed her toward and admitted, honestly, that the markers were suggestive rather than conclusive, and that nobody in the field had prioritized surveying that specific parcel simply because it sat slightly outside the boundaries of the basins everyone already knew to focus on. "It's not nothing," Dr. Anand told her. "But it's not proof of anything either. You'd need actual samples." That distinction between suggestive data and actual proof was exactly the kind of gap Naomi had spent 22 years closing professionally, and she decided, with the same careful, unhurried patience that had defined her whole working life, that she was going to close it herself if nobody else was going to bother. The purchase itself raised eyebrows throughout Millard County, but the months that followed raised considerably more. Naomi didn't build anything or run any kind of visible operation on the property. She simply drove out several times a week that spring and summer, working methodically across the flat with a hand auger and a set of brine sampling equipment she'd bought secondhand from a decommissioned university lab, collecting subsurface samples at carefully spaced intervals and logging each one with the same rigorous documentation standards she'd applied to thousands of samples over her career. Dale Ferris, who ran the closest working ranch to Naomi's parcel and had known the Kessler family for decades, watched her routine develop that summer with genuine bafflement. "She's out there with a hand drill, taking little cups of mud back to her truck," he told another rancher at the diner in Delta, the county seat, that June. "Never seen anybody care about salt flat dirt that much in my life." The comment made its way around Millard County the way most odd projects did, repeated with a chuckle, generally affectionate but not remotely serious about the idea that anything valuable might come of it. Naomi processed her own samples through a combination of basic field testing and, for the more detailed analysis, a paid arrangement with a small independent geochemical lab in Salt Lake City that agreed to run her samples at a reduced rate given her own technical background and the modest scale of what she was submitting. The results, arriving in batches through that summer, showed lithium concentrations that started as merely interesting in her earliest, shallower samples and grew increasingly significant as she drilled deeper and expanded her sampling grid across the property, eventually identifying a subsurface brine zone whose lithium concentration matched, and in several samples exceeded, figures from actively developed deposits elsewhere in the region. By early autumn, Naomi had assembled a dataset thorough enough that she felt confident bringing it back to Dr. Anand formally rather than as a casual sanity check. Dr. Anand's reaction, once she reviewed the complete sampling grid and concentration figures, shifted quickly from polite interest to genuine professional excitement. She connected Naomi with a colleague at the Utah Geological Survey, who reviewed the data independently and confirmed what Dr. Anand had already begun to suspect. Naomi's amateur, self-funded survey had identified a previously unrecognized extension of a commercially significant lithium brine deposit on ground that had somehow escaped serious industry attention despite sitting adjacent to basins companies had already spent considerable money surveying. Word moved through the relatively small world of Utah mineral exploration quickly once the state survey's preliminary confirmation became part of the public geological record that winter. Within 2 months, Naomi had received inquiries from 3 separate companies involved in lithium brine extraction, ranging from an established regional mining operation to a newer battery materials startup backed by venture capital, specifically targeting domestic lithium supply chains. Each wanted exclusive negotiating rights to Naomi's parcel, and the competing interest, once it became clear to all 3 companies that the others were also pursuing access, escalated into the kind of genuine competitive bidding situation that Millard County's diner regulars found considerably more interesting to discuss than Naomi's original hand auger routine had ever been. Naomi did not rush the decision. She hired a mineral rights attorney out of Salt Lake City, a careful, methodical woman named Renata Ibarra, who specialized in exactly this kind of small landowner negotiation against much larger corporate interests, and together they spent nearly 4 months reviewing competing offers, ultimately structuring a long-term lease and royalty agreement rather than an outright sale, keeping Naomi's ownership of the land intact while providing steady income tied to actual extraction volume over the deposit's projected operating life, a structure Renata estimated would likely prove worth considerably more over time than any single upfront purchase offer the competing companies had proposed. Dale Ferris came by that spring. Once survey trucks and exploratory drilling equipment had become a regular sight on the property, he'd once watched Naomi work alone with a hand auger. "I told everybody at the diner you were digging in the dirt for fun," he said. Naomi laughed and told him that was more or less an accurate description of how it had started. Curtis, who'd questioned the purchase from Salt Lake City the previous spring, drove down that summer to see the operation for himself, standing at the edge of what was now an active exploration site with an expression of open astonishment that Naomi found, privately, more satisfying than she expected to. Naomi never made much of what happened at the salt flat. When people asked how she'd known, she usually said some version of the same thing. She hadn't known, not with the certainty industry geologists eventually confirmed, only that a pattern in old survey data had bothered her enough to check properly, and that checking thoroughly and without assuming the answer in advance was the one professional habit 22 years in a laboratory had never let her set aside. There is a particular kind of value that survives beneath ground everyone else has already dismissed, waiting only for someone patient enough to test rather than assume. Naomi Whitcomb didn't set out to find a commercially significant lithium deposit or spark a competitive bidding war among mining companies. She set out to solve one more careful technical question the way she'd solved thousands of them over her career, methodically, without cutting corners, and without accepting that dry, cracked ground on the surface meant there was nothing worth measuring underneath it.